Anthropogenic climate change is one of the greatest moral and global challenges of our times, yet we are only now beginning to think about it in terms of justice. What are the demands of justice in relation to the climate change underway because of human activity and carbon emissions? This paper sketches a framework for thinking about this question. And regarding anthropogenic climate change, or hereafter just climate change, I will note that there is a consensus of 96 to 97% among all scientists who hold degrees and conduct research programs related to climate science. And this consensus is that human conduct contributes significantly to the change in the climate of this planet that it is experiencing, and the change in climate holds various manifestations. And one of those manifestations is a general warming of the biosphere and erratic and strange weather patterns. Because the fact of climate change is established, the questions are about how severe and how quickly climatic and other natural phenomena are changing, and what our best predictions tell us, and what we should do in response. In this paper, I will not address what we should do in response in any kind of detailed way, but rather I will suggest one way of thinking about what we should do in response. That is, conceptions of justice that guide and will guide our responses to the causes and the effects of climate change. The anemic, indeed near absence of serious response as of now, suggests that we hold impotent conceptions of justice. The "we" in this claim is a complex notion. Clearly, a certain coalescence of sufficient commitment to justice and morality, more generally, is necessary among a certain set of powerful stakeholders in the complex of political and capitalist powers who are the gatekeepers to a sustainable future. Yet, it is also true that these elites, who are crucial to whatever turning needs to be made, can be and will have to be influenced by those of us who will be willing to engage in moral discourse, consumer activism, democratic power, and direct actions in order to force these gatekeepers into the necessary changes in their motivations and conduct. We have seen moral discourse and consumer activism and democratic power and direct action work this way before in many instances, and recounting a number of them is unnecessary. It may very well be the case that the discourse about and the direct actions against the Keystone Pipeline are responsible for saving us from that immoral adventure so far. And it may be that the discourse, the democratic power and direct action, perhaps with some consumer activism thrown in, will keep us from being subjected to fracking gone wild. Recently, George Lakey has defended Bill McKibben's article in the August 2nd, 2002 issue of Rolling Stone. That's a great philosophical journal you should all be familiar with. In respect to McKibben's idea of who the we are in this question of justice. Responding to critics of McKibben's article, who argue that nearly all members of rich countries make millions of consumer choices that drive climate change, and therefore take issue with McKibben's focus on the fossil fuel industry, and others who Lakey simply calls the 1%, Lakey argues that the choice to buy a car instead of a bike is categorically different than a CEO's choice to blow up a mountaintop in order to mine coal. The fossil fuel power structure is, of course, a constellation of components that include the fossil fuel industry, many U.S. corporations, front groups that launder corporation purposes and transforms language of profit into other kinds of discourse, for example, freedom, and conservative political foundations and think tanks, so-called astroturf organizations and campaigns, and direct legislative and judicial political power. And McKibben's argument is that this constellation must be confronted. He writes that basically there is only one problem: putting a price on carbon, which is a necessity, would reduce the profitability of the fossil fuel industry. He then adds that we might work to transform this problem of profitability, and it's a moral outrage which could plausibly give rise to real movement. But here we find an implicit conjunction of the shapers of energy policy and those who run the fossil fuel industry and their political handmaidens, the gatekeepers, on one hand, and the rest of us on the other. If moral outrage is to have the effect it might have, it will be generated by us, from below, as it always has been. In a myriad of ways, the we who are the subjects of the justice that needs to inform our response to climate change is a complex matter. And it is important to worry about this question. But this paper is not about how to parse this problematic. It is about how a particular understanding of justice, which is compatible with other conceptions, can be helpful. As we learn justice, the hope is that we can also communicate it in compelling ways, and thus build the moral outrage referenced by McKibben, and seen many times before in our history. So at this juncture, I summarize the capabilities approach or the human development approach in questions of justice, and I'm going to take these terms to be synonymous. So the human development approach, the capabilities approach for this paper, the same thing. The theoretical paradigm is also a program and has been having a substantive influence on various organizations and processes such as the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Human Development Report Office, and the Sarkozy Commission report on the measurement of economic performance in social groups. The Human Development and Capability Association, which launched in 2004, along with its journal, the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, these items, these organizations, these institutions, and these developments are all to the good, in my view. And I think the human development and capabilities approach should be understood as a supplement, a corollary, and a partner to human rights theory and the human rights programs that we hold dear around the globe, especially, of course, in the West. Rights, capabilities, and development are concepts and normative goals that I think are best understood in tight and mutually supportive relationship to one another. I suggest an analogy that can help us understand the human development and capabilities approach. It is this, and the political philosophy students here will appreciate this most, I suppose. Just as communitarianism came into existence as a complaint against the shortcomings that exist or thought to exist in liberal theory, and in explicating these complaints has had a significant impact on liberalism, acting as a stimulant to the reworking of liberal theory and development of stronger forms of liberalism, so too the human development and capabilities approach can be seen as, among other things, a stimulus to better thinking about the meaning of human rights. And just as communitarianism is both a theoretical approach and a political program, and so influences liberalism in both of these domains, so also the human development and capabilities approach influences rights discourse and programmatic institutions. The human development and capabilities approach, now embraced by a growing number of theorists, was pioneered by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. Conventional theories of justice have worried about people's holdings, what they have. Rawls's utilization of primary goods, of course, is a seminal example. But, as Sen has put it, we need a theory of well-being. An account would have to be taken not only of primary goods that persons respectively hold, but also of the relevant personal characteristics that govern the conversion of primary goods into the person's ability to promote her ends. What matters to people is that they are able to achieve actual functionings. That is, the actual living that people manage to achieve. In his Tanner lecture entitled The Equality of What, Sen presented the capability metric as an improvement upon the primary goods metric. He argued that the primary goods approach seemed to take little note of the diversity of human beings. If people were basically very similar, then an index of primary goods might be a good way of judging advantage, but in fact, people seem to have very different needs, varying with health and longevity and climate conditions and location, etc. Nussbaum writes that there is an approach to issues of basic justice that can take us further than social contract doctrines can. We may view it as an extension of Rawls's theory. The hope would be that if we keep working on both types of theories and they generate related results across a wide range of areas, that this harmony will give us confidence that we are on the right track. Nussbaum is not alone in seeing the human development and capabilities approach as an extension of and compatible with the primary goods and other welfarist, resourcist, and contractarian accounts of justice. Sen sees it this way, as does, for example, Thomas Poga, Elizabeth Anderson, and Richard Arneson. As I noted above, I certainly think of the human development and capabilities approach as compatible with human rights approaches, and therefore implicitly with primary goods, welfarist, resourcist, and contractarian approaches more generally. Of course, important differences remain, but there is a large overlap. The human development and capabilities approach is oriented toward outcomes. It is interested in what each person, considered from one's infancy onward, can become, can be, and can do. Thus, Sen's word functionings. Each person, taken as an end in the Kantian sense, is to have properly a life in which she develops and has sufficient opportunities to have her capabilities nurtured and developed toward ends that are chosen by herself. Thus, the human development capabilities approach is the work, it does work with commitments to freedom. One of the strengths of this approach is the work it does to understand in theoretical and concrete terms the close and mutually supportive relationship between equality and freedom as intrinsic to justice. Sen writes often about human beings as equipped for doings and beings, and Nussbaum notes that the human development and capabilities approach is fundamentally concerned with respect for people's powers of self-definition and is resolutely pluralist about value. This approach is concerned with qualities in people's lives, not just quantities. The conventional means of measuring justice as certain aggregations of goods, for example, gross domestic product, fail to adequately measure well-being. The GDP of a country can increase at the same time the percentage of its people are deprived of basic education and health care and civil rights can increase. Justice is, in the end, about persons' well-being. Nussbaum's version of the human development and capabilities approach focuses on the protection of areas of freedom so central that their removal makes a life not worthy of human dignity. The question is then, what does a life of human dignity require? I hope you've all thought about that. She offers, as a bare minimum, a threshold level of 10 central capabilities that all political orders should secure for their citizens. These central capabilities are life, which is to say life itself, bodily health, bodily integrity, our senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, being able to live with and with concern for animals and plants and the world of nature, play, and 10th, control over one's environment, political and material. Nussbaum thinks of the capabilities as being first and foremost belonging to individual persons and only derivatively to groups, but this conception can be overdetermined. And of course, it is one of the areas in which communitarians have corrected to some degree liberal theory. And we know that persons in the full Kantian sense of dignity and respect and integrity and autonomy are also ongoing social constructions. So, nonetheless, as contractarian, welfarist, and resourcist approaches lose the individual at times in their versions, often in utilitarian and consequentialist versions, it is a strength that the human development and capabilities approach refocuses on the individual. Sen writes that his capability approach is focused on judging and comparing overall individual advantages. And it is a departure from concentrating on the means of living to the actual opportunities of living. And he adds that the capability approach is thus not just what a person actually ends up doing, but also what she in fact is able to do, whether or not she chooses to make use of that opportunity. All of us in this room want to have a broad set of opportunities, even if we choose not to take advantage of them, right? In some audiences, when I say something like that, people respond, amen. Amen. Responding to the criticism that the human development and capabilities approach is too focused on persons as individuals, he writes that he has been quite unequivocal in not assuming any kind of detached view of individuals from the society around them. He uses Marx to buttress his point. What is to be avoided, Marx wrote, is above all the re-establishing of society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. He notes that while it is important to understand individuals as members of groups and that they belong to any number of groups simultaneously, to see a person as merely a member of a group is to have an inadequate understanding of both the person and society. Sen writes of poverty as capability deprivation. By focusing attention away from the means of living to the actual opportunities a person has, the capability approach aims at a fairly radical change in the standard evaluative approaches widely used in economics and other social studies. Now, the last aspect of the human development and capabilities approach that I want to mention is something scarcely touched upon either by Sen or Nussbaum, nor indeed many others working in this approach. And here I focus on the concept of development and capabilities in their teleological frames. The ideas of capability and development intrinsically contain the notion of ends. Implicit in the conception are the questions, capabilities for what? And development toward what end? Here, the human development and capabilities approach has strong consonances with Aristotelianism and natural law theory. Of course, teleological ideas get smuggled or transported with differing degrees of transparency into liberalism as well. Kant and Mill being, I think, rather transparent. Rawls, for example, much less so. But in any case, it is helpful to think about nurture and growth and actualization of ends when thinking about capability and development. And this is true in regard to human animals, but also, I think, true in regard to non-human animals and non-animal species as well. When thinking about the consequences of anthropogenic climate change on human beings and on other species, it is important to ask if the consequences are depriving individuals and communities of various kinds, human and non-human, of futures toward which they have the proper capability to develop. For example, does climate change significantly reduce the opportunity for a flourishing life characterized by the capabilities as listed by Nussbaum, as I read moments ago, for any one human, any human community, or species? Are proper processes of growth and determination, freedom and development truncated, damaged, or eliminated by climate change? Well, the answer to these questions is, of course, yes. There is the present about which we must worry, and then there's the future about which worry hardly suffices. About the present. We are emitting carbon pollution and raising the temperature of the earth, endangering and harming many forms of life on the planet, including human lives. According to McKibben, when the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference failed, commentators angrily lamented and did one Greenpeace official, Copenhagen is a crime scene tonight. And newspaper headlines responded with disillusion, such as Copenhagen, the Munich of our times. Yet we have continued to abuse the earth without hesitation. Now, about the future. We have 2,795 gigatons of carbon in our reserves, just waiting to be burned. This is 5 times more than the 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide that scientists say is the limit to pour into our atmosphere by mid-century, and still have some reasonable hope of staying below the 2 degrees Celsius that scientists tell us we cannot pass without disastrous consequences. What kind of consequences? Some countries will flat out disappear. This is, of course, of great concern to small island nations. If you're here tomorrow at 11 in the morning, not 11, but yes, 11, you'll see a film about an island disappearing and almost gone, and its president trying to let that not happen to other island nations. African delegates at Copenhagen chanted, 1 degree, 1 Africa, after being warned that 2 degrees Celsius meant a suicide pact for drought-stricken Africa. This coal and gas is still in the ground, but economically, it's already above ground. It's figured into share prices. Companies are borrowing money against it. Nations are basing their budgets on the promised returns from their patrimony. But then if you are Exoil or Lukoil and you're told to avoid wrecking the climate, you will have to keep your reserves in the ground. And that became public, as it would, of course. The value of your companies would plummet. There are another 2 views of the present and the future, and these views are empirically driven factual accounts and are correlations to the facts that I've just mentioned. Right now, climate change is bringing destruction to Earth, to people, and to other species. In the future, that mayhem and that death will increase exponentially. Extreme weather brought about by climate change is already having devastating consequences across the globe, as, for example, Christian Parenti makes painfully clear in his book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. And if you haven't yet looked at your program, you'll see that Christian is speaking here this afternoon at 2:30. What happens when peoples clash over scarce resources that become ever more scarce? What happens? Well, what happens is that when malaria-carrying mosquitoes move into new climatic zones due to climate change, due to warming temperatures, they now infect people who had never known malaria with malaria, and thousands of those people die. Thus, for example, in Thailand, thousands of people are dying from malaria, and it's not the fault of Thailand. Indeed, I am probably more responsible for the deaths of those people than are the citizens of Thailand. What happens is that conflict and violence and illness and death occur, directly caused by climate change and exacerbated by climate change. So, if justice is conceptualized in tune with the human development and capabilities approach, it then becomes clear that anthropogenic climate change is an affront to justice, precisely because it threatens, it shortens, it damages, and in some cases eliminates the opportunities many people have to develop, or certain capabilities are stolen from them, and others receive insufficient address or nurture. In short, climate change threatens not only the future, but for many, the present. If human beings are meant normatively by the logic of human dignity to live lives where they can grow and develop and enjoy capabilities that correspond to human rights and may surpass various conceptions of rights, climate change is clearly a violation of the proper functionings of many human beings. If left unabated, climate change will soon ruthlessly violate justice for millions of persons and eventually most of humankind. Now, here I might mention that injustice is a kind of violence. Peace and conflict scholars talk about direct violence and structural violence and cultural violence. We've learned these terms from Johann Galtung, and they are now standard. And cultural and structural violence aren't about putting bullets in people's bodies or dropping bombs upon them. It's about coercing them by poverty, by politics, by economics, and by any number of means which diminish, damage, or eradicate their lives. Dying, for example, from poverty may not look like violence to many, but it is violence in slow motion. And when we think about it, most of us would rather die quickly, in fact. So, another way to put this matter is that anthropogenic climate change, because it is injustice, it is also violence. What is true of humankind is also, in important ways, true of other kind. What is the relationship of climate change and global justice? Well, here I want to borrow from and go beyond Nussbaum. In her Frontiers of Justice, she considers the question of justice for non-human animals, focusing on the level of individual members of species and the question of whether and to what degree they can experience pain and suffering by means of their sentience. She follows Bentham and Peter Singer and James Rachels and others. That is, in terms of capability, differences of capability affect what good or harm can come to a creature. Harm is found in the thwarting or blighting of the capabilities that are proper complements and components of a creature's life. Yet Nussbaum is concerned not only with the individual creature's ability to experience pain, she also considers the capacity for movement from place to place, the capacity for emotion and affiliation, for reasoning and so forth, she writes, as capabilities to be protected. To the question of how species flourishing is determined, Nussbaum notes that within and among species we can observe norms, and that these norms give us the appropriate benchmark for judging whether a given creature has decent opportunities for flourishing. She seems to be thinking only about non-human animals, but it seems to me that the same kind of judgment is available to us regarding non-animal species. Clearly, this method renders species-specific accounts of relevant central capabilities, but this seems the only plausible possibility. It is also clear that this approach calls for close observation and study of other species so as to discover, as best we can, how they pursue their own flourishing. Now, Nussbaum argues that animals have entitlements based upon justice. She runs through the basic minimum capabilities mentioned above and relates them to non-human animal life. For example, in respect to the capability of life itself, she writes that the gratuitous killing of non-human animals is wrong. In respect to control over one's environment, she writes, the important thing is being a part of a political conception that is framed so as to respect them and to be committed to treating animals justly. Now, there's no need here to offer a full summary of Nussbaum's argument. The important thing is to note the character of her argument, and I think it is a wise beginning. I would, however, like to go beyond Nussbaum in two respects. First, she writes only about non-human animals, And I think the argument about capabilities and development should be applied to other biota and perhaps even to other assemblages of nature. For example, ecosystems, watersheds, oceans, and estuaries, etc. Now, I'm not certain about how to do this in respect to assemblages of this kind, but I am considerably more certain than non-animal biota that biota other than animals live lives with proper ends that attend to them. Here, by the way, the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, and that's process philosophy. I think Lynn was shaking his head there. And the process theology that has stemmed from Whitehead's work would be of great help for you budding philosophers out there. It seems it would be a violation of capabilities and the intrinsic goods of development to burn down a forest or burn up a prairie, just as it would be so to slaughter forest owls or prairie dogs, simply for perverse human entertainment, because trees and grass have capabilities and ends too. Of course, determining what the proper capabilities of non-animal biota are may be more difficult than with animals, but that does not thwart the teleological nature of all biota, and therefore the concern for proper realization of capabilities and development of all biota. The second way I think we can improve upon Nussbaum is this. While I have noted that the teleological reading of our conceptualization of life, and human and otherwise, comports with the human development and capabilities approach, Nussbaum does not apparently see this connection. And I count this a missed opportunity in her argument. Just as we properly say that human beings ought to live lives with sufficient opportunities to nurture and develop their capabilities toward well-being, so too the same claim can and should be made about non-human biota. When philosophers or theologians write of the intrinsic value of all biota, surely the meaning of intrinsic value must bear some relationship to future states of those same biota. Embedded in the meaning of intrinsic value is the notion that without justified reason, the harming or killing of those biota is morally unacceptable. If this is the case, the future of the biota in question are meant to be secured, all things being equal, in terms of their natural life. Intrinsic value cannot coherently mean something about an instant only. It must mean something about the proper and natural meaning of the life of the biota in question, which is a claim about the span of such life. So I am here saying that the human development and capabilities approach has a kind of application and reference to non-human life, indeed all biota, and perhaps, as I said, other natural assemblages. And just as this is the case, it strengthens the argument for truly global justice. So in this paper, I have argued that the human development and capabilities approach is a kind of architecture or framework or metric or approach for understanding justice and violence that is compatible with human rights theory and contractarian, welfarist, resourcist theories of justice. I have also suggested that it improves upon these conceptualizations, although I did not explicate this claim because I only have so much time here. I have not set out to defend the human development and capabilities approach against other approaches, but rather I have argued that it is a particularly useful way to understand the claims of justice and peace in response to anthropogenic climate change, precisely because climate change threatens and harms the capabilities and the development of many human beings and many other biota. And it threatens to do so with a vengeance in the very near future. I've here offered only a sketch of the claims made, of the argument I've put forward, but a full explication of the components of my argument would, of course, take a bit more time. Yet I hope that I have sufficiently persuaded you to think further about and perhaps make investigations about the human development and capabilities approach and the dire present, not only future, dangers of anthropogenic climate change, and how one interrogation might inspire a response to the other. Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions, and maybe Lynn, you could take this around to whoever asks one, and I'll just speak loudly. Questions? You're all in a hurry to get to your next class, I see. Back there.
What are some of the capabilities of other biota outside of animal life that you have mentioned that is threatened as a result of climate change?
Well, you mean other non-animal biota?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, trees are meant to grow upward, generally. Rivers are meant to flow. Oceans are meant to maintain a certain kind of equilibrium and acidic and alkaline balance and give life to the biota within them. Estuaries are meant to have a certain function in ecosystems. Watersheds are meant to give us sufficient amounts of water, and so on. So these are proper ends, one might say, I certainly say, of nature, assemblages, what I call assemblages of nature. And climate change often abrupts, distorts, diminishes, or damages those proper ends. Now, I realize, of course, that nature isn't just one thing, right? I recognize that nature, by being nature, changes. You know, rivers dry up on their own, not just because we dry them up, right? Fires start by lightning, not just because people leave their campfires too early. So I'm not so naive to think that only human beings affect nature, and that every time human beings affect nature, we affect it in some improper way. I don't think that. I believe that view would be farcical. But it still remains the case that I believe in nature, all biota have proper ends to themselves, and we sometimes affect those ends quite dramatically and destructively and unnecessarily, and it's a moral problem. It's a moral problem not only if we value nature because we believe it has intrinsic value, but it's a moral problem also because it endangers the well-being of future generations of human beings. Any other questions?
Back there in the corner. Is that Aaron?
Okay, that's Aaron. And then Mark has one over here.
Thanks, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking as you were presenting, and one of the challenges that we face, of course, is getting corporations and others who are in many respects largely responsible for a lot of the emissions and the pollution which plays a role in climate change. One of the problems is getting them to sign on to the argument that you're making, which is that if we look at this as human capabilities and human rights approach, then they would, if they believe that, there would be an interest for them in not polluting and doing different things to not, contribute to climate change the way that they do, or maybe even convincing them that it's a problem in the first place. So, what are, as you were putting together your presentation, what are some of the ways in which we might address some of these challenges?
Okay, so I did say, and I think it's abundantly clear, that the fundamental contributors to, and therefore the fundamental problem about anthropogenic climate change comes not from individual actions like I should ride my bike more, of course I should ride my bike more, these things, but that we have gigantic, important structural, political, and economic decisions that we've made that we stick to stubbornly, which are damaging. And of course, as you mentioned, Aaron, many of these decisions are driven by corporate powers who want to make money. And of course, the political persons and institutions I called handmaidens who also want them to make money. And so the question you asked is, how do we change that? And I do think that we can't expect people who are highly invested in profoundly high levels of profit, who profit in effect from producing climate change, to have some kind of moral conversion, and for the requisite thousands of people to have those conversions, so that entire industries and entire economies and entire technologies and entire political systems will magically change. That's not going to happen. So it's going to happen, as I suggested in my paper, borrowing from McKibben, but I agree with him, of course, is that pressure has to come upon those powers from below, as I said, from us. And that is not going to be moral persuasion, although I'm all for moral persuasion. But in addition to moral persuasion, there have to be leverages we use that affect their self-interest. And so we need to work very hard at demanding through our own lives, through our own political lives and our own lives as consumers, different kind of products, the different kinds of production, different kinds of technology, and different kinds of items and processes and politics and economics, if we want to have a different future than the one it appears we're going to have. And so that means boycotts, it means divestment, it means strikes, it means outrage, which is made manifest in very practical, concrete terms. And this is not a mystery, because this has happened throughout history in many respects and has had great change in many instances, both in respect to political power and corporate power. Mark, did you have a question?
Question, yeah. It seems like it's hard enough to get people in governments to care about the development of human beings. So by expanding that sphere to plants and animals, like, that seems to me like it's going to make it even more, like, it just seems like it's enlarging the challenge. So specifically, and I understand that these things are important, especially when talking about the environment, but it seems to me that, you know, that it would just be easier pill for people to swallow if you focus on people first. So what are the main significance? Why is it important to care about the rights of the plants and animals before tackling the issue of people?
Okay, that's a great question. I agree with you that it's hard enough to get the CEO and the board of directors of Exxon Mobil to care about their own grandchildren, right? So why are they going to care about trees? That's true. But I'm making a philosophical argument here, so you know, it's worth saying in a certain context that there are reasons to worry about the planet itself, not just the people who inhabit the planet. I will also say this, though, and I mentioned this a moment ago, so I'll just briefly restate it. We're part of nature, too. Nature is a part of us. You know, Homo sapiens and other species are not somehow disconnected. And in fact, our welfare, the welfare of people, depends upon the welfare of nature. It depends upon the welfare of the planet. It depends upon the welfare of other species. It depends upon these assemblages of nature, as I put it. And so you can make arguments to people about what they should do just in regard to their valuing other people. And, you know, you might know secretly it's going to be good for the planet also, but it's not important actually to make that argument for most people. It might be important to make an argument like that to members of Earth First, maybe. But you're fundamentally right. But you tie these two things together, that if you care about people, you must also care about the planet, because it's connected. Yes, you can just talk really loud.
Okay, I'm actually just wondering, I can see this on a global scale, how violence affects, not violence, sorry, how global warming affects violence, but, sorry, do you have any like local examples of how that change occurs here?
All right. Well, yes, there's one obvious example. Everyone in this room knows what I'm about to say. The air quality here, ... You know, a few weeks ago, some of you might not know this particular fact, but a few weeks ago, the 6 most polluted cities in the United States were all in Utah. You know, our Greg, you probably didn't know this, or Tariq, right? I mean, but you wouldn't, you know, if you're a visitor and you look at the beautiful mountains and the blue sky, you can't imagine what winter is often like here. And the air quality is horrendous, and people suffer. People suffer greatly. And not just people with asthmatic conditions and certain kinds of, diseases already, when that's bad enough. But young children, by virtue of being young children, even if they are otherwise healthy, suffer profoundly from that air quality. That air quality is horrendous, and it should be unacceptable. And what happened in the legislature a couple weeks ago? As soon as the air quality got better, they stopped talking about it. I mean, they had the memory of a gnat, right? I mean, everyone was worried about air quality one day, and, you know, the sky was blue the next, and they stopped talking about it in the state legislature. So that is the most obvious and immediate way in which climate change has a relationship to human health locally, because this air quality is in part, obviously not entirely, but it's in part due to climatic change. And, you know, we create this anthropogenic climate change. We produce it, we contribute to it by, for example, having more and more people come to existence on the planet and create the greenhouse gases we create. By growing the livestock we eat, which, I don't know, is an animal or who or which, creates the greenhouse gases that, you know, trap pollutants. And so this is the most obvious thing to say. And I think, you know, I think if you're a Utahn, you should be profoundly worried about our air quality. I mean, how could you not be? And if you're worried about air quality, you should be worried about climate change. You know, they're very much connected. So that's what I would say. Can you speak loudly? Because we want to capture you on film forever. Just your voice.
I was just going to say, you said that it creates poverty, and I'm just wondering, how can that be? Because, I mean, we can fix that by helping others and teaching people how to, you know, it really has nothing to do with
How does climate change create poverty?
Yeah.
Well, I'll say a couple things. Greg is going to talk about this shortly, but it creates, not all migration, of course, is due to climate change, but climate change creates considerable human migration. Think about the need to pack up all your belongings and walk away from your home because you can no longer grow crops where you used to grow them. Or you can no longer raise the livestock you used to raise because the pasture land is now gone. Or you can no longer afford the energy bills that have, you know, increased tenfold. Now you are forced into poverty. So this is the kind of way one could go on, and there's a literature about this, and I can share that with you. But, you know, these are 3 ways, very briefly, that climate change creates poverty. I mean, in 2010, in the Fergana Valley, a region shared by Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, in Osh, ethno-political violence broke out. 1,700 Uzbeks were killed. Exasperated, I can't go into all the details, although it might happen later today. because the utility bills became so high, because the resources became so scarce, that people, the Uzbeks who lived in Kyrgyzstan, there was retaliation against Uzbek peoples by Kyrgyz because the scarce resources now were putting economic pressure on everyone. Some people suffered horribly cold winters without any heat. And the reason why those resources were gone was because of anthropogenic climate change. The ambassador to Kyrgyzstan will be here tomorrow morning. He'll talk about this. The watersheds are rapidly diminishing in Central Asia. And the lifeblood, the necessity for life itself for the people in Central Asia depends upon those watersheds. So climate change does indeed create poverty. And not usually creates it, de novo, just out of nothing, but it exasperates it. It makes it worse. It makes it harder to fix. Oh wait, let's get him first because we already had you once.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you support localism? From the sound of it, do you think that our society is too far spread out? We require too many things like vehicles and other such things to maintain our current lifestyle. We should be living on a smaller scale.
Yes, we should all live. I mean, maybe this isn't true of Haitians, right? But at least everyone in this room, probably, should live on a smaller scale in many, many ways. And for example, when you take a bite to eat in this country, whatever you put in your mouth, if it's typical, on average, has traveled almost 2,000 miles to get to your plate. That's just plain stupid, right? Yeah. So we really do need to live where we work and work where we live and travel less and cluster more and eat locally grown food and eat better food and not import all kinds of things. If you walk across the street to Walmart and you buy a shirt for $8, there's a reason why. And it may very well be because a 12-year-old Pakistani girl is literally chained to a loom for 16 hours a day sewing that shirt. And that's horrible and immoral, and that's a crime. But then that shirt gets flown halfway around the world. So you can buy it for $8. That is so stupid in so many ways, right? So I couldn't agree more with your premise.
So do you think that, ironically, we're too global as an economy?
Well, we're not global enough, and we're too global, just in different ways. Yeah, so we have to be much, much, much more global than we are in many, many ways, and much less global than we are in other ways. And it's not an either or. If anyone ever talks to you about that global versus local in binary terms, don't let that happen, because that's not helpful. We won't solve any problems that way.
Thank you very much.
There was a question in the back.
It seems like there's an inevitable type of, I don't want to say genocide, but life requires consumption. We require some type of consumption. There's an inevitable, you could say genocide against plant life or animal life. Bovine flatulence is one of the leading causes of deterioration of the ozone layer. I didn't make that up. So no matter what, there's a little bit of stepping on the capabilities of other forms of biota. We can't avoid that. So at what point have we reached social injustice or violence against nature? Because some of it is necessary, but at what point is it injustice?
Well, of course, it's all the answer to your question is all packed into the word unnecessary. And we have different ideas about what that means. And, we argue about it, and that's a good thing. In a healthy republic, in a healthy political association, in a place where real democracy exists, there are a lot of very good arguments about very important things. And so no one knows all the answers to that question because it's far too complex for anyone to know all the answers. But the general principle I laid out, and I think you just agreed with, is if it's not necessary to cut down timber, don't cut it down. If it's not necessary to grow livestock and create factory farming, don't do it. You know, there are certain things we of course think are necessary. We say that it's necessary. I know in many of my ethics classes I say to students, you know, we don't have to eat meat. And then one student or another will say, yeah, I really do. But no, you really don't. You know, some people, some places do, sure. But no one in this room has to. So, you know, we also have to be very courageous and think very, very hard about what we mean by the word necessary. And if we had the moral courage to do that, what we think to be necessary would surely shrink. But that's a good question. Any other? Maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
Seems to me that the crux of the situation is the exponential growth of population. Is your experience, have you seen in other countries, especially China, India, are they doing anything to curb their exponential population growth?
Yes, some countries that tend to be poor, just to use one simple word, are poor, and have high population growth, do a number of things to curb that population growth. And of course, there are many things you can do. Some countries are trying to create more people. They're encouraging population growth. I'll tell you something very funny. It's also sad and wrong, but President Putin, right, of Russia, actually had Boys to Men, I think, come give a concert in Moscow to increase, you know, all those romantic songs, you know, you'll have more babies after the concert, right? That's true, actually, you know, so. Anyway, so you've put your finger on one of three very important components of a problematic. One is human population growth. One is climate change, as we've been discussing. The other is our consumerism, as has been raised. Given our population growth, given our consumeristic patterns, what's necessary, and given the fact of climate change, we have created quite a stew for ourselves. And to begin to undo it, we need to respond in all three of those ways. I was talking with someone 3 weeks ago who was just worried, very worried, that population growth wasn't growing fast enough and that some countries might even lose people. And I didn't want to be, I just nodded my head, you know, because he's someone I don't know that well. I didn't want to get into an argument with him. But I just thought, I was saying, how's that the problem? How is that a problem? I mean, for you who are like biblically minded, how many commandments are human beings given in the Bible? The answer is thousands. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. One of them is be fruitful and multiply. That's the only one of them we've ever done. You know, we ought to move on to the other ones, don't you think? Any other, one more question perhaps down here?
Do you think in a way we've already tipped the scales on climate change? Like, do you think that we're actually going to be able to, stop it and go back?
All right, did you all hear the question? Okay, this is a very difficult, complex question. I hope everybody today who speaks gets asked it and they will all give better answers to it than I will. But I, first of all, I don't know. I'm not sure. But this is what I think with a great deal of uncertainty. I think it's not too late to give to our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, and future generations a decent life. But we have to do very substantive things right now for that to happen. And the substantive things we have to do are relevant to all three of those components of that problematic I just mentioned. And it will require, for example, using different kinds of fuel sources, driving less and eating less meat and so on and so forth. It will involve changing our consumer patterns and learning to live with less crap. That's a philosophical term, crap. And many other things. I don't think it's too late. Some people, a lot of people do. I don't, but we can't continue. It's not likely our great-great-grandchildren will have lives like ours. They might have lives like, say, the typical citizen of the Czech Republic, maybe. More modest lives, decent lives, good lives, wonderful lives, lives that in fact are better than ours, given all the data that measure human happiness. They're happier than we are, in fact. They have better lives than we do, but they don't have as much stuff. So we actually might give now that I'm saying this, we might give our great-great-grandchildren a great gift by giving them happier lives if we give them the opportunity to have less crap. We'll see. We won't see, but others will. Okay, I think maybe that will be it, and thank you very much.